Journalists are powering the AI boom.
Of the top 10 sites that AI companies are using to train their models, 5 of them are major news sites.
Yet, as AI companies hit sky-high valuations,
News organizations are getting killed.
it's a contradiction that feels wholly unfair. However, after doing extensive research, I found that news organizations are dealing with this new reality in two main ways that I'm going to break down for you guys today.
But what's most interesting
Is that there's a separate solution brewing that would make journalists the richest they've been in decades, which hopefully will make it easier to convince my parents that I actually will be able to make a living as a journalist. Okay, let's get into it. To really understand the ways in which news organizations are dealing with the harsh realities of the AI era, you first have to understand the concept of fair use, as it's central to news organizations' argument that AI companies are unlawfully stealing their copyrighted content in order to train their own AI models. In essence, the fair use doctrine is a case-by-case legal analysis that is used to defend those accused of copyright infringement. Under copyright law, there are 4 factors to consider to determine whether use of copyrighted work without permission is legal. Usually, using small amounts of copyrighted work in a way that transforms the copyrighted work into your own original thing is considered to be fair use. But the fair use doctrine is not an exact science. Not only are each of these 4 factors inherently subjective, there isn't really a set standard of what is or isn't transformative use. AI companies are claiming that even though they are scraping unlicensed copyrighted content to train their models, the answers they are putting out present news organizations' copyrighted content in a totally transformative way. Therefore, their unlicensed use of it should be considered fair use. News organizations feel differently. Many of the largest news organizations have argued that AI's usage of their copyrighted articles is not transformative, but rather just a verbatim copy of their journalists' work, or a quick summary of their work that eliminates the audience's need to go to the news organization's website, resulting in less traffic, and most importantly, less revenue. And that's not just unsubstantiated fear.
Around a quarter of people surveyed in the US are using AI chatbots instead of traditional search.
And has led many in the journalism industry to see AI as an immediate and existential threat. The first way that news organizations are dealing with this is through licensing deals. We've seen news organizations from the likes of the Associated Press, the Financial Times, Axel Springer, and the Washington Post agree to license their content to AI companies for their LLM training in exchange for monetary compensation. And, at least in theory, these licensing deals provide 2 major benefits for news organizations. First, as news organizations continue to weather financial turmoil, this compensation provides some immediate financial relief. And as AI leaders like OpenAI and Microsoft are quick to point out, their licensing deals with news organizations aren't the only way they're aiding news organizations in the journalism industry at large. But frankly, that's kind of where the good news about these licensing deals ends. As you probably know, if you've ever spent time using AI chatbots, they tend to hallucinate, meaning that they spit out inaccurate or misleading information, or even worse, just make up things entirely. And unfortunately, news organizations, many of whom have signed licensing partnerships, have fallen victim to these AI hallucinations, even creating fake links to these news organizations' articles that take interested users to invalid 404 links instead of the news organization's website. This makes the news organizations themselves seem less credible and reduces the very traffic increases news organizations were anticipating when signing these licensing deals. However, the trouble does not stop there. A big question that has surrounded these flurry of licensing deals is, how do these deals actually work? When most of these deals are announced, they include the same vague terms. But what does that actually mean in practice? Are these just blanket payments that compensate news organizations for all different types of data at the same rate, no matter the rate of their usage and effectiveness? This lack of transparency isn't a mistake. It actually seems to be part of AI companies' broader strategy to maintain leverage over their news organization counterparts by publicly getting credit for compensating news organizations without actually having to dig into the details of how this compensation works in practice. It's why many, including The Information's Jessica Lessin, have argued that news organizations taking part in licensing deals is a huge mistake. AI companies had no problem using troves of news organizations' copyright material even before these licensing deals went into effect. And now by doing these deals, news organizations are validating these AI companies' actions. and showing that because tech platforms have a bottleneck over distribution in the ad tech market, these news organizations have no choice but to accept any offer these AI companies offer them. But many news organizations believe this shouldn't be the only way. Major news organizations like the New York Times and News Corp believe that in some cases, certain AI companies should be held responsible for their unauthorized use of copyright materials, and have decided to take these companies to court instead. And while the cost of litigation is certainly high, a judicial ruling in favor of news organizations' argument that this isn't fair use would dramatically alter the way LLMs could be built in the future, and would return a lot of the leverage back to the journalists that are doing the hard reporting in the first place. In the case of the New York Times versus OpenAI, which has so far served as one of the landmark litigation cases between news organizations and AI companies, early indications are showing that the case could go in the New York Times' favor. In April of this year, a judge ruled against OpenAI's motion to dismiss the case. From a legal perspective, the New York Times argument can be viewed as one of romantic authorship, in which they are honing in on the importance of originality and individuality, and painting their battle versus OpenAI as good versus evil, which could very well end up being an effective strategy. But it's a strategy that makes the New York Times seem incredibly hypocritical, given some of their past legal arguments regarding fair use. Most notably, the Supreme Court case, New York Times versus Ticini. In that case, the New York Times found itself on the opposite side of a copyright battle, with a group of freelance authors arguing that the Times had uploaded a bunch of their articles to the Times digital archives without permission. And without getting too much into the weeds of the case, the New York Times argued that uploading these freelancers' articles to their digital archives constituted a mere reproduction of the freelancers' work that was allowed under Section 201C. The Supreme Court didn't agree, concluding that the Times' actions did not meet the protocols of Section 201C. Therefore, the Times had violated the freelancers' copyright. Now, if we fast forward back to the New York Times versus OpenAI, it's not hard to see the parallels between OpenAI's argument now and the New York Times argument then, with both arguing that a decision that outlaws their use of copyrighted data would have a significant impact on their businesses. And while it may not be a parallel that will have an ultimate ruling on the outcome of this case, it is an important reminder that navigating copyright law amidst rapidly changing technological shifts is a challenge for anybody, not just for the New York Times, but also for well-known authors like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Sarah Silverman, who sued Meta in 2023 over Meta AI's use of the author's books for training. However, they ultimately lost that case to Meta, with the judge ruling that the authors had not presented a sufficient argument that Meta had violated one of the four main factors of fair use. But remember how I said there's a new solution brewing that could make journalists more money than they've made in decades? This is where that new solution fits into this story. While we've seen that licensing and litigation can lead to positive outcomes in certain instances, there are simply too many glaring cons. From a lack of transparency over deals and frequent AI hallucinations, to high costs of litigation and a divided legal precedent. It's a reality that other countries around the world are facing head-on by way of legislation, in order to create desperately needed systems that allow news publishers of all sizes to get fairly compensated for their work. Australia and Canada have both enacted legislation to help news publishers of all sizes collectively bargain against tech companies so they can receive fair compensation. And that's actually a big deal. Most news publishers, especially local news publications, suffer from a huge bargaining imbalance in their negotiations with tech platforms. So enabling collective bargaining among publishers and forcing tech platforms to negotiate with these publishers in good faith is a huge step forward in trying to save local journalism from dying altogether. Furthermore, this legislation enforces transparency requirements, requiring digital platforms to notify news publishers about changes to their algorithms that could affect traffic that news publishers receive, which is again a smart move. But this doesn't mean that this legislation is perfect. Actually, it's far from it. Australia's enacted legislation does not include specific language about generative AI in particular, and given generative AI's unique ability to keep users away from news sites altogether, this lack of wording around generative AI is a problem. So how do we improve this promising yet flawed legislation? According to top scholars, it requires rethinking how we actually measure journalism's monetary value to AI. And an effective way to do that is by identifying journalism's monetary impact on the three main parts of AI systems value chain: training, refining, and retrieval augmented generation. As you probably know, AI models need an incredible amount of content and data to train and refine off of. However, with top chatbots spreading misinformation at double the rate that they were last year, the reliability of the content that AI is training itself off of is coming into question. And this is why high-quality, fact-checked journalism is so valuable to not only training and refinement, but to retrieval augmented generation, which is when LLMs search external databases to provide more detailed, fact-checked answers than what they can provide just from memory, playing an important role in helping to reduce AI hallucinations and helping to improve the credibility of both the chatbots and the news organizations that these chatbots reference. Yet, major tech platforms like Meta and Google haven't exactly been happy with the legislation enacted in Canada and Australia. Both companies pushed back hard against the legislation, with Meta and Google both threatening to pull the country's news content from their platforms in protest, drawing condemnation from top government officials like former Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And while legislation in Australia and Canada is still intact, fierce pushback from tech platforms has shelved similar legislation from being implemented here in the United States. Notably, in California, Google's protest was ultimately successful and led to a more friendly deal for them. And it was a deal that raised many eyebrows.
However, the deal shelves proposed legislation that would have instead forced tech giants to pay news organizations for distributing their content.
But despite tech companies' strongest efforts to skirt more stringent legislation, they can't escape the reality that without good data, AI systems will be far less valuable in the future. Therefore, the journalism business, which provides so much of this quality data, needs to be supported financially. Even Perplexity, the AI company that has been continuously sued by publishers, has begun to recognize this. At the end of the day, whether the best way to make sure that journalism and AI are strong going forward is to push for strong legislation here, or just hope that AI companies finally come to their senses, is actually above my pay grade. But what I do know is that tech companies actually have less leverage over publishers than they've had in a long time because of AI's insatiable need for quality data, which presents a unique opportunity for journalists to cash in. If you like this, please like and subscribe, and we'll be back with episode 5 of 8 Ball.